Welcome back to the Lost and Found podcast with me, Sabri Gazail. And I've had about 7 months away from the podcast. I've taken a hiatus. And if you are returning, then thank you so much for coming back. It felt like I needed to take a little time away whilst I was managing and navigating other aspects of my life, my personal life, my business, and also whilst I was deepening my own study and my own spiritual practice, which I feel like has been deeper than ever this last year. I felt like I wanted to take a little pause from the podcast to then refine what felt aligned. And whilst in many ways it's going to have the same flavor and essence, the same desire to bring deep conversations about life, existence, spirituality, philosophy, psychology, behavior, and the human experience, I also sense that the direction it's going to go in will be maybe a little deeper, a little more rigorous. And some of the guests that I want to invite on moving forwards, I would say would reflect that depth and rigor. That being said, so many of the guests that I've already had on are so incredible, and I will be delighted to have them all back on. But just as I find myself in what feels like a new chapter of my own life, I wanted to pause and then relaunch the podcast when I felt like everything was aligned with a unified aim and vision as we move forwards. So with that being said, my first guest to relaunch is Ethan, who I met through John Vervaeke's online lecturing program. If you aren't familiar with John Vervaeke, he's an associate professor of cognitive science, psychology and philosophy at the University of Toronto. He used to teach with Jordan Peterson, and I believe he's been on Jordan Peterson's podcast more than anyone else. He truly is a wealth of knowledge, about as deep and rigorous as I've ever seen in cognitive science and philosophy. And Ethan acts as a co-host and interlocutor for John in his online lecturing program, which I am deeply honoured and feel privileged to be a part of and to be on monthly calls with the two of them. So Ethan graciously accepted to come and join me for an episode where we talk about pseudo-spirituality, the necessity for theory and practice, and really this kind of convergent point between cognitive science and application and practice, and really deepening into the experience of the spiritual, and some of the things that can act as blocks in that, and how rife pseudo spirituality is, and we'll get into exactly what that means. Before we get started, let me just read out a short bio about Ethan. He is the artistic director of 5 to Midnight and a practice researcher working at the intersection of actor training and 4E cognitive science. He holds a Master's of Arts in Professional Practice, Theatre and Drama Facilitation, and offers an interdisciplinary ecology of practices known as TIAMAT. He frequently appears on podcasts discussing the importance of ritual, performance, and theatre techniques in enhancing well-being, psychological development, and finding meaning in life. And finally, he acts as the Director of Community Development and Partnerships for the Vervaeke Foundation. Now, Ethan is going to be in London at the end of July, I believe it's the 25th to the 27th, and there's going to be links below to be able to attend his workshop if you're interested in that, which really offers this ecology of practices over 3 days. And he gets into more detail about what is going to be involved in that in our conversation. So the links will be below to find that, to find his website, and to find him on socials. And also, Ethan has offered for any of our listeners who comments on YouTube or Spotify to be entered into a draw to win a free ticket to attend the TIAMAT Tier 1 workshop that is going to be taking place in London. So comment on YouTube, on Spotify, and let us know what you think about this episode. What was your biggest takeaway? What landed for you? And if you comment, you'll get entered into that prize draw to win a free ticket to attend the full workshop. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it, whether it is your first time listening or you are returning. It's an honor to be hosting Ethan and to be returning with another episode of the Lost and Found podcast. And before we get started, if you do want to connect with me, the links are going to be in the show notes and the description as well. All right. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Ethan. Ethan, brother, welcome to the podcast. So, first of all, I am delighted to be doing this, and we'll intro kind of how we got connected, but also just to kind of preface that I've taken hiatus from my podcast for 7 months, mainly because I was aware of a distance that I was starting to feel with some of the direction that the podcast was going in, which was more in the realms of the New Age and the pseudo spirituality. So when you mentioned that as a possible conversation that we could have, it just felt like perfect. And I was wanting to relaunch in what felt like a more clarified way. And the very fact that you suggested that as a point of conversation felt like the most appropriate way to relaunch. So, welcome.
Fire, thanks a lot. I love this little bit of synchronicity that sort of occurred. I had no idea that you had taken a hiatus from the podcast, and for what it's worth, it's hard. Maintaining a podcast is really tough. And, you know, I know you from kind of like the what we do on the Lectern, which is the online course platform for John Vervaeke that I helped run. And I was really taken by the way you showed up to those. And the questions that you were asking, man, like those are actually in a lot of ways very pertinent. But you also showed up with a good deal of vulnerability that allow, and I mean that in the sense of like affording John and I the opportunity to really open something up, and that's happened consistently. And you've showed up the same way again for this podcast, even right, to sort of pop that open. And it is a spicy topic. For what it's worth, I'm wrestling with that myself as someone who leads practices, facilitates these practices, and is a pedagogue at the core of it. This question of, okay, how do I hold what I know is going to be very profound for people with due diligence and with a sense of responsibility, and how do I talk about it? So over the next hour, I'm going to be wrestling with that, good sir, and I'll ask for your guidance to help shepherd that in the most appropriate direction. So thank
Yeah,
you for having me.
you're so welcome. Maybe before we get into it, if you could introduce yourself a little bit, like a little bit of your journey as to, the things that we're going to be discussing today. What your path has looked like to get to this point.
Yeah, sure. Elevator pitch time. So uh, it's been about 15 years that I've been doing what I would call sort of this work. But what I mean by that is being on a long form journey.
Mhm.
I started as an actor in the theater primarily, and then I did a lot of TV, did a lot of theater work in Singapore, where I'm originally from. And then I started getting into actor training because I was really interested in how people got to do what it is that we do. While I was pursuing sort of being a director, being an actor, and all that sort of stuff. But actor training was really at sort of the core of it because I was fundamentally experimenting with myself and trying to figure out, okay, what works. So that took me all the way till, let's say, college. I went to drama school in London, and that was a profound shift where, for really what is the first time in a very intense context, I was around people who are oriented in the same direction. Like, we all want to pursue this dream, we all want to pick up these skills, and that amplifies the kind of impact that the training does have. And I think that was probably when I was really faced with and I don't mean this in a light sense, like the existential confrontation with what it is to be seen by others in a particular way,
Mm.
and to orient one's life to taking that up as a calling, and how important it is. And so that's why I've started to talk about actor training specifically, but performance practice more broadly, as you're practicing what it is to be a person. And that's tough, because a lot of people, we don't get to practice being a person in daily life, right? But actors get to do that. So there's a unique opportunity there. And so I took that into my master's, where in my master's I have a Master of Arts in Professional Practice for Theatre and Drama Facilitation. So it's how I design and hold spaces with folks. And while I was doing that, I got to meet John Vervaeke, right? And his work on Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. He introduced me to Vervaeke Foundation, Vervaeke Cognitive Science. He introduced me to philosophy in a really rigorous way. And we've been working together ever since. This was 2022. And like most people, he's given me a vocabulary to actually like describe and thereby transmit what it is I do. And in doing that, I can hold it to a particular standard, and I can have it checked and understood and studied and rationalized. And I'll go a little bit more into what I mean by that, right? Which is not purely logical, but really like proper proportioning of things so that I can hold what I do responsibly. And so since then, this was 2022, that was around sort of like the end-ish of COVID. I started to be able to have the opportunity to be more ingrained in this space and with the people who are doing similar work, who are interested in similar things. And from there, I'm like, okay, cool. Now we can do a Euro tour every year where I get to teach my ecology of practices, which I call TIAMAT. It stands for the Integrative Approach and Methodology of Actor Training, of Active Transformation. Sorry, I was saying things like that. And I'm now doing my PhD and really trying to make a case for the ecology of practices, as not just pertaining to actor training, but really just in terms of more broadly the general public's access to wellness, to a sense of meaning and purpose in life, and also by virtue of those things, or virtue itself, but also a way of kind of developing an existential resilience against things like pseudo spirituality is one of those things, but also the imminent threats of modernity, like how do we deal with AI? How do we steel ourselves against the pressures of social media? How do we come to understand ourselves as beings in the world, being in the world? So that's sort of it was a bit longer than an elevator pitch, but that's roughly where we got to. Yeah.
Elevator pitch for a tall building, we'll call it.
Yeah.
You said some really interesting things there. One of the things that struck me is when you said about the actor training, and it just made me consider in that moment that in many ways, most of us, really, all of us, we're all playing a character that we just really believe is us. Like, there's a character of Sabri that I have cultivated over my life, whether I know it or not, that I really believe to be me. And I guess in that, there's this level of coherence that I experience if I am accurately playing Sabri to how I believe he ought to be. And I just wonder, the idea of like, I've just made this no method acting. There's this, and there's this idea or notion that sometimes actors can get lost in their role, which really does kind of bring the question up of, what does it mean to be me, and how much of that is just a character that's been cultivated over a lifetime that's just happened that I now really believe to be me, and the belief of that keeps me locked in it, and how much of actually consciously or explicitly considering the character I am and working on that just allows us to become a character that we would rather be if we actually had the choice.
So that's, you're asking a really profound question, and you're pointing at ultimately what is the distance between identity and difference. So I'll take what you said. I'll do the annoying philosopher thing of spinning it around, just to illuminate a point, which is when I talk about identification, it's yes, you have a certain way of being that you can call Sabri. by virtue of that, you also have the opposite ways of being in which you can see are not Sabri, right? It's not me. So they're disidentified from you. And at the end of the day, they're all still ways of being, they're all still ways of interacting with the world. But the crux here is, what do I consider to be in the box of moi, and what do I consider to be outside of that box? And I go, no, 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 that's just a drunk Sabri. When that's when he's had far too much vodka and is now angry at everybody, right? So I don't know if that's the case, but just for an example, right? So this calls into into question kind of the notion of character. When we talk about character, particularly for actors, the way I've heard it talked about, which frustrates me, and I imagine frustrates most actors, is that it's not a mask that you put on. We're not talking about the development of persona. We're talking about character more in the sense of character development, which is your motivations, the way you see the world, the way you act in the world, and by extension of that, why you do any of that at all. Right? So when I think of how do we cultivate character, I'm really talking about this, like the ethical formation of a person, your ethos, your the ways in which you network how you make meaning in the world, such that you be in a way proud, not in a sinful way, but in like a agentic way, like I choose to be this person, and I want that, right? And if that's good and it takes you further down the path of who you like to be, we call that an aspiration. If it's somewhere in the past that is an old pattern that's habitual, we call that a regression. So I think this is where, when we talk about ecologies of practices, and particularly for TIAMAT, when I teach it, it's like I really want people to understand that the process of becoming a person is not the collection of a series of tools. That's the equivalent of putting on a mask. It's the equivalent of crafting a persona. What I'm really talking about is being able to take on a way of being that is transformational. You're in a process of transformation all the time. All persons are. And in order to be a person, one has to be that process. Yeah. There's a lot there, but I'll also leave that there for now. See how that lands with you.
Yeah, I really like that. The idea between aspiration and regression, a regression to who I was versus an aspiration of who I can be and become. It feels like an opening myself to the possibility.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And that's play. That's why it's like Tiamat is all play. It really is a serious play, but it's play. And I think what's happening in our culture today, when you can look up on a search bar, self-help, right? Self-improvement whatsoever. And there's all these lists of things that you gotta do to be to increase your productivity or increase your whatsoever. What was it that I've heard most recently? How to find your inner multimillionaire or something like that. And while there are ways in which that's useful for certain people at certain points in time, that's not the end in and of itself. Because if maybe the person that you are becoming is something that you don't actually know what it is, because if you know what it is, how can you become it? There's a contradiction there. Some part of it is always going to be unknown. And if you grab all of these things and go, well, okay, I'm now going to craft a daily schedule that's based on all these YouTube videos that I watch. Fantastic. Now you have a full-time job. Right? And then where's the time for the family? Where's the time for, being in a relationship with somebody? And a deep, meaningful one. I made that mistake in my last marriage, which is unfortunate, and I learned a lot from that. But I think there's a way in which one can take up a more sort of self-help, self-optimization kind of train to a very detrimental end, that we forget like what it's all for, why we're doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's you know, that list you mentioned, it then just becomes a list completely rooted in doing and not in being. And and
Exactly.
there's then this continuous feeling of, why do I not feel the way that I want to feel? Well, it's because I'm not at all focused on being. Everything is doing, and everything is seems to be in the pursuit of something that is out there, over there in a distant future, that maybe will lead me to maybe being then. Maybe I can be then.
Yes, just not now.
Yeah, just not now. Yeah, exactly. Okay, I really like that, the aspiration and the regression. So pseudo spirituality. Let's dive into that, because you know, when people ask me, "Are you
Mm.
spiritual?" I pause and I think it really depends what you mean when you say spiritual. Because if you mean like crystals and tarot cards, I mean, and that's lovely, but no.
Hmm.
If you mean, do I believe in spirits? I'm not sure, but I'd lean more towards no. If you mean like, do I have a level of devotion to the cultivation of human spirits, and to deepen into practices that are in a devotional manner to continuously transcend and become, you know, lose myself to find myself type of thing, transcend myself to find myself. Yeah, I feel really
Hmm.
devoted to that. But I feel like a lot of the pseudo spirituality, it it first of all, it feels like it means anything now. And I think also, for a lot of people, it becomes this idea of, what do you believe? Like, do you believe in Santa? Like, is it like it's just a set of beliefs and nothing about actually a path that is embodied and acted upon? So, what are your thoughts about the idea of pseudo spirituality, and what do you see around that?
Well, I think it's actually got quite a lot to do with what you've just named. I want to just double click on a few things and make sure that I'm tracking you. When you say that when you think of spirituality and you define it as that which animates oneself, right, as an embodied entity in the world,
Mm-hmm.
like, that there's a dimension of that which lands properly with the word spiritual, right? So spirit to be the animating force,
Yeah.
right? And you also did a really good sort of like distinction. Yeah, it's a distinction piece where there's all these beliefs over here, right? And then there's the embodied experience and enaction of oneself in the world. And just because you have the beliefs, and similar to what I was saying earlier about collecting tools, you can also collect ideas. You can collect all of those, and they can be completely divorced from the way that you behave in the world. So when I think of pseudo spirituality, I think I point more towards the kind of processes that move people in this direction
Mm-hmm.
rather than in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, one of the ways, so I feel like this is like 10 ways to know that you are in a spiritual, pseudo spiritual sort of scenario. Um, One of the things which really stood out to me is a lack of criticality. So, pseudo spirituality, and this is coming from sort of the work that I've done on cult dynamics, is that you can't criticize the belief.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't criticize the belief, you can't bring it into dialogue with other things. So, for example, if someone says, oh, I've met this prophet who has an amazing website where he puts all of his prophecies out there, and so many of them have come true. If I go, okay, well, I looked at that and that didn't happen. That's not the way that it works, right? Essentially, just doing fact checking, right? Which is what I mean by rationality. I want to proportion what I'm seeing with with other things that I'm seeing or hearing or perceiving in the world. And they'll go, no, 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 that's not what he means. He means this other thing, etc. Right? Well, now I've just been rug pulled, all goalpost shifted, and now I have to chase that thing again. And they'll keep doing this. And this is what Harry Frankfurt calls bullshit. Right? It's like this constant goalpost shifting where one cannot bring criticality in good faith, right, to the proposition, and then now I can't be rational about it because I can't fact check it. Like, let's take what you're doing here now, right? It's like I can say any number of things to you, and you're doing, rightly so, the critical rational thing, which is to ask me questions about what it is that I'm saying, right? And then you're checking it against what you know and what you've experienced too. And that does two things. One is that, it helps clarify. I imagine it helps you clarify and understand where I'm coming from. But it's also really valuable to me because I need to know, okay, maybe this thing that I said is stretching a little bit too far. And I have to rely on you, Sabri, to tell me like, oh, that's actually not how it occurs to me. I could go, okay, that's something that I can hold on to, right? Pseudo spirituality doesn't afford that. And if you're not quite sure about, if you're not yet convinced, maybe you can try this out. Wherever you are, okay, go pick up 2 newspapers, different newspapers, okay? And then go look at the horoscope sections in those newspapers. And then see how different they are. I mean, we tend to read that this is confirmation bias. We read it, and what we do is we connect that into our life and we go like, oh, this newspaper really sees me, But go look at different sources and then go on a website, right, that gives daily horoscope readings and see what that says. And you can do this fairly consistently. Why? Why does that occur? If it was really true across the board and pointing at a universal truth, shouldn't they all be the same? And this is not to say I'm not shitting on horoscopes, right? Don't get me wrong. I'm trying to point at the mechanic that's beneath that, which is, and coming back to the dialogical piece, you're the one reading it. You're the one interacting with it. And it's powerful because you're making meaning of it through that lens. And that's really good. Because if you're reading a horoscope and it goes, oh, your love life is going to face some trouble in the next week, maybe what it does is it primes you to look at all the ways in which, hey, there were problems there that you might not have paid attention to. And you could really intervene on those in a powerful way to change the trajectory of that relationship instead of leaving it to, maybe harbor some resentment or something like that. You can turn your attention towards it. That's what it's trying to do. It's not trying to tell you the ultimate truth of how things will be forever and ever. You're already interacting with it. And this is why I think we have to be very, very responsible as people, right, in the ways in which we interact with practices, with spiritual communities, or with spirituality as a whole. Because whether we like it or not, we're not just consumers of it. We're co-creating. We're collaborators.
Yeah. Yeah. Would that point to something like the transjective?
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly. I tried to explain transjectivity in a different way. Yeah.
Let me have a go explaining this for the listeners, and then you can weigh in. So, transjective would be the idea that maybe if we think like using this as an example behind me, if it was like subjective, objective, but the idea of transjective is that it's mutually affording, that the two things affect each other, and it's a continuous affecting. So it's not just the two things stay static, how they affect each other transforms how they are, and it continues in that manner. Is that a
Yes.
reasonable explanation?
Yes, it's exactly what's happening between the two of us now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So exactly like that. So even in us sharing ideas, like how I am right now is not exactly the same as how I was 20 minutes ago, just through the nature of this conversation.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Leaning a little more into the pseudo spirituality, it seems to me, and I want to really get your feeling on this, because it seems to be an emergent thing for a reason. It's pointing to something else that people are seeking. It seems to me that there's this, a lot of people have abandoned the original religious institutions, Voltaire, remember the cruelties.
Yes.
And I think for good reason, but then people have been left kind of looking around, well, what's the thing where I can find some meaning?
Mm-hmm.
And then, oh, here you are. There are all these possible things, and then it feels like it's become a little bit like a world buffet, kind of like
Mm-hmm.
a neo-paganism of sorts, perhaps. You know, like I'll have a little bit of this, and I'll have a little bit of that, and I can definitely, you know, witness that in myself. I've definitely been on that journey as someone
Yeah.
who, you know, I'm 37 now. I
Mm.
started listening to Wayne Dyer when I was 13. Um, I first read the Tao of Jeet Kune Do by Bruce Lee when I was 12, and I was like, oh, this is really
Nice. It's a great
interesting.
book. Yeah, yeah. Very practical book. Yes.
Yeah, and then I started listening to some Wayne Dyer and some other kind of like, you know, self help and like kind of human potential movement type speakers, you know, all the way through. And then about a decade ago was the first time I sat with ayahuasca, and that was definitely a bit of a pivot point for me.
Yeah.
Was that
As it would be. If
yeah,
not, you're not having ayahuasca.
that's right. Yeah, that,
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
one night I actually had the feeling of, oh, because I would have called myself an atheist before that.
Hmm.
And that night, it was the feeling of, oh, that that God that I don't believe in. Yeah, I was right not to believe in it, but then just blowing me open. And well, that's probably a really good short phrase, blowing me open. My openness
Mm.
increased dramatically, and that's, you know, the last decade I would say has been then deepening in and navigating, and then also, you know, seeing some of the, you know, the trappings, and seeing, I know plenty of people that have gone really far down the plant medicine path where it feels like they've lost all kind of grounding of rationality,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um and yeah, like just, I think to John's work on the meaning crisis, I think it feels to me like the pseudo spirituality is somewhat of a response to the meaning crisis and the movement away from traditional religion. Although I think we're seeing somewhat of a comeback.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, what would you say? Because for me, what's important is what is causing the movement in that direction. What is it people are actually seeking? Because I feel like there's something meaningful, maybe it is meaning, that people are seeking, and then what are the ways in which we can maybe start to respond to, you know, if people have gone, okay, I don't want to do the religious, I guess people are wanting to move away from the shadow of religion, we could say. So maybe
Mm.
but they're still seeking means to come over here, and they've found pseudo spirituality. But what's this third point, and how do we find it?
Oh, there's a lot of steps there. Okay.
And I want you to answer all of that in just 5 minutes, Ethan.
Challenge accepted, my dear friend. I actually might give it a good shot. So okay, let me see. Let me see if I can home it within a metaphor. Um, if your house burned down, okay, and you don't have a place to go, you're gonna look for a place to go, and that might range anywhere between the neighbor's house, which if you might have a good relationship with them, and you could bunk with them for a while, right? It could be the homeless shelter down the street,
Mm.
or it could be the next staircase that you find. And it's very hard to tell. Unfortunately, it's not as clear cut as a physical structure what the best home is
Mm.
and what you might need from that place. And when it is in an abstract space, right? Like you had named earlier, in the abstract space of belief and propositions, okay, then how do we tell what's the best place to be? Now, let's double on top of that, right? Did I say double on top of? Double down on that. Let's double down on that, good sir.
We'll do both.
Right?
We'll double down and we'll double on top.
Yeah, I go down, bottom up, top down. Okay,
Exactly.
so we'll double down to go up. The metaphor, which is this sense of like you can only know how how homely of a place that is and how well you belong. And I think that's the key, one of the key pieces, like belonging, right? How well one belongs in that place when you're there by being in it. Because it's very hard to tell from the outside, oh, this is for me, you know? And we see that in kind of like this archetypal, not archetypal, but stereotypical sort of pattern. If you ever watch Beef on Netflix, right? Of like, an atheist sort of laughs at the church and they go, I don't believe in all that, right? Then they go and attend the church service and they have an experience similar to what you just described on ayahuasca. It's a mystical experience, transformative opening up of oneself to the world. And it's not about belief completely at that point. It's a lived experience of a world that's larger than what one was in earlier. That goes, oh, wow, okay, I want to stay here. This is where I want to be now. And that's a choice. That's an agentic choice. And coming back to what we were talking about at the start of this podcast, I'm trying to draw threads to what we've already explicated because I think that helps flesh out the picture. So people are looking for a place of belonging, right? And deeply, that sense of significance. It's a kind of value, but it's a value that's not transactional. It's a value we're talking about value in the sense that's intrinsic, in the way that life is valuable. There's something, it's not even something about it. Like, words fail me at this point, right? It's the ineffability of someone for just the fact that they are. And we take that, and it's very easy to counterfeit that with variations of oh, you're loved by everybody here, things like that. Oh, we all accept you. That's okay. That's tough. That's tough to reckon with because I understand the need for that. I understand the hunger for that. We all want to be seen and known and valued purely for being. And we want to be in a place where in a lot of ways it's safe and we can always come back to. That's what home is. But, coming back to the picture behind you of like what's that third piece is the possibility of transcendence. And I don't mean this in the sense of I don't mean this rapturously. I don't mean that my soul becomes leaves my body and now I don't mean it that way. I'm talking about transcendence in the sense of getting to higher order patterns. Right? I used to be a nihilist deeply for many years. That was how I made my art, and I built a whole worldview around it of like, I gotta have something to say, I gotta have a message. I have to, lament and essentially make very expensive live action depression memes. And then realizing that, okay, actually, what if that wasn't all? Right? And then that's sort of me taking my spiritual practice much more seriously, right? I took my yoga practice more seriously, took the meditation practice more seriously, start to know John's work, took science more seriously, so that it could home the period of my life that was nihilistic, but also in a way leave blank pages to write new stories. I'm not throwing any of that away. If I was, I wouldn't say it to you now. There is a part of me that understands what that's like and might always have the potential of being there. But it doesn't mean that that's all life is and can be ever. The creation of that space, that possibility space, that's where the rational piece starts to drop in. I'm proportioning my nihilism in the time of when I was maybe 15 to 25. Okay, that's where it is. That's the oil. Show me the water. And so I really want to encourage folks to consider rationality not as the reduction to its logical conclusions, but rationality really as a sense of proportioning to make space for more. And I think I've moved a little bit away from your question, so I'll try and be responsible and bring it back to it, which is, I think the hunger for a spiritual home, which is shared by many, religious or not, right? Like kicked out of religious homes or not, that hunger for a spiritual home is deeply tied to our sense of belonging in the world. It's deeply tied to our sense of being valued by our immediate community, but also by the culture at large. And I think we've lost a lot of that. Right? But also the possibility of transcendence and how we can be better people, and in doing so being better persons. So that's what I would say to you. How's all of that? It's a lot, but I wanted to make a clear argument.
Yeah, yeah, there was a lot there, a lot of really good, valuable points. You know, I think because it was one of the latter things that you said, and it just landed with me, was the idea of belonging. And I feel like maybe that's one of the big pieces, is this feeling of belonging, but it's like I like to feel like I actually belong in my own body,
Mm-hmm.
to feel like I belong in my immediate surroundings, but also to feel like I actually belong in a greater story of reality itself.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I actually feel at home in here, around me, but also beyond.
Cosmically. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Like, does it actually make sense? Can I make sense of this so it actually affords me this sense of belonging in reality? Do I actually feel like I'm intended?
Mm-hmm.
And that for me, I would say is one of the big places I've landed at, is it feels that a lot of self-help and even, the Western therapeutic model is based on, if we were to call it, the separate self. But
Oh, I like that. Yeah, yeah.
it's very much me that is separate from everything else. And I just don't think it can get anyone there, because I think the thing they are, I made this point, I was on someone else's podcast recently, and she
Mm.
was saying, how can we learn to love all of our parts unconditionally? And I said, stop trying. I said, I think that's actually a runner-up prize for not knowing God's love.
I love that. Yeah, that's the consolation prize. You're consoling yourself. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Good, good, good. I
And,
love
and,
that.
and by, and by God, I mean a more, well, ineffable, but maybe we could say, if I actually know that I'm intended in a greater image of, or understanding of reality, this cosmic story,
Mm-hmm.
I'm no longer then trying to love myself, because I feel like loving myself is actually predicated on a belief that doesn't believe I'm actually meant to be here.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah, yeah, yeah.
rejecting myself, and and my mind is dichotomizing this part of me, yes, this part, no, this part's allowed, this part isn't. And actually, I think we see that in Genesis, that's eating from the tree of knowledge and good and evil. The first thing that takes place, of the first judgment that takes place, is self-judgment,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and then it's shame and hiding from
The
God.
covering up. Yeah, yeah.
And I think we want to know that sense of mattering and belonging beyond just what I think about me, and not just what the immediate people around me think about me, but actually what goes beyond that, and feeling like I actually matter and am intended and have meaning in that greater story.
Well, I'm gonna throw something your way. See if it's a monkey wrench. Okay. Um, who is it important to that you belong in the world?
Hmm.
Where do you have to be to judge that you belong in the world and therefore that sense of belonging is important?
Where do I have to be? Was that the question?
Yeah. Yes.
Here. To me, the answer would actually be the awareness of my very existence is evidence that I belong in the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I wouldn't. And it's kind of like, it seems like a very obvious thing, but that is kind of, that's how I consider it in my own worldview, is 13.8 billion years of evolution led to this moment right now of us having this conversation and us existing and me being here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm intended by reality.
Mm-hmm. And
So,
are you in this? Are you in this experience at the moment?
yes.
Right. So it's both. Right. So you're in the experience of the being,
Mm-hmm.
but you're also aware that you're in the experience of the being.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that this experience is inherently, intrinsically valuable.
Yes.
Right. Again, not in the instrumental sense. In exactly what we're talking about, the cosmological sense. Now, to your point about the self-help thing, it's also very easy to separate that, right? We call this a kind of intellectual bypassing or spiritual bypassing, which happens a lot. One is no longer in the experience of the world. There is some kind of fantasy or a deep solipsism, or like, oh, all this is an illusion. We hear that a lot nowadays, right? And then stand above that and go, all of this is shit. None of this is real, right? Even I'm not real. And we talk about that as depersonalization and derealization, something which plagues actors very vehemently, right? And again, it's not a unique problem to the people who decide to entertain you at 8 p.m. on a Friday night, okay? It's a perennial problem. Like, I'm sure that I'm sure you're familiar with this, that, many people, whether close to us or online, right, love this sort of matrix idea. They're like, the world is an illusion. If it was, then you are too, right? If that were the case. And someone asked me this question of like a few years ago, of how do you know that the world is not an illusion? So he was confronting me with a solipsism. And I said, look, okay, what does that mean? And he said, well, we're all just illusion generating machines. So every single person here, right, is generating their own kind of simulacrum of the world. They're all generating their simulation. I went, okay, cool. Let's take that to be true, right? So is it right to say that if I were to gather everybody in the world, right, into a large room, right, and I said, okay, you're all living in your own individual idiosyncratic simulations. Is that true? And they all went, yes, as if they could, right? And I said they all went, yes. Okay. Then what we can say that is objectively true is that we all share illusions. That makes it objectively true. It's not everything is subjective and we're all an illusion. So it collapses his entire argument.
Mm-hmm.
Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah?
And I always, I'm obsessed with this. I see the world through this. So if someone makes an argument over here, I go, okay, what's the
Mm-hmm.
opposite? And then I go, but what's the truth that they might be pointing to? I was thinking about this literally just earlier, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me what you think about this.
Yeah.
So if we were to take like generative modeling
Mm-hmm.
and predictive processing and active inference,
Mm-hmm.
like how much it seems like I feel like people are trying to point to a truth that they might be able to sense, which is how often are they experience things outside of them. And they might get to it's an illusion, but it's actually no, I've got a generative model and I'm interpreting things in a very particular way. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe the question is, what if I'm not interpreting this accurately? Am I looking at this through a particular lens that is creating a distortion? And I feel like maybe people are sensing something more like that, but they've not been able to actually give those words to it, which is, I don't know that how I'm seeing things are how they actually are. And
Uh-huh.
And I think that is like, there we go. Okay, let's look at that. Let's look at that because we've got something there.
Well, a distortion implies that there is a proper attunement,
Yes, and I
right?
think that is the whole point about the being, becoming, the transcendence. It's almost like, can I shed the limited perspective that I have, and can
Mm.
I see with new eyes? Can I see with new eyes? So, almost like a humility that's required to continuously allow me to let go of the potential distortions through limited perspective, and always expanding to be able to see more, something like that.
I would raise you on that, and I would say, it's not just seeing more, right? Because that can easily be hijacked with all sorts of perception
Mm-hmm.
altering beliefs, right? It's also it's deeper than that. It's being more,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? So it's not just okay. So this is you invoke predictive processing, and I'll meet you there, right? So predictive processing, right, is the notion that we are anticipating creatures. Okay, so what we do is that we generate a rough approximation of what something is perceptually. Okay, this is why optical illusions work, because the brain is trying to anticipate, and then the optical illusion is set up in such a way that it anticipates different depending on where you put your focus. All sorts of fun stuff. Okay, so things like that. We're anticipating creatures, and you are absolutely right that we can those can be distorted,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we're not and but the distortion doesn't mean that it's wrong, because that would also imply that there is an absolute one correct
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that. It's much more about attunement. It's much more about whether or not the anticipation is creating ways of being in the world. And that's precisely what predictive processing runs on. It doesn't run on, I'm not generating an image. When I'm in predictive processing, we're modeling ourselves interacting with the world, and in doing so model the world, and in doing so we model ourselves. We're actually anticipating interactions with the world,
Mm-hmm.
not static series of images that flash by. And again, I'll throw in another metaphor. Okay, so I play guitar, right? Now, there's a way in which you can tune your guitar strings to be at 444 hertz. You can tune them at 440 hertz. You can tune them at 432 hertz. Okay, each string.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a string that's tuned at 440 hertz, right, versus a string that's tuned at 432, which is sort of like this, like, oh, it's like a sacred frequency or whatsoever. 432 is actually kind of flat compared to 440, but it feels different.
Mm-hmm.
If you had one string that was tuned at 432 and the other five that were tuned at 440, that string would sound flat.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a choice. You can tune all the other five strings down to 432, at which point it sounds great for certain kinds of music, right? Usually in the Eastern side, it's like Eastern music. I know a lot of J-pop uses it now, right? But if you try and play Wonderwall on 432, you're going to sound flat.
Mm-hmm.
You got to tune everything up to 440. Right? So why am I laying out this elaborate metaphor? It's to say that if we are imposing upon the world a dualistic standard of correct or wrong, or real is fake, that's not going to help you. It's actually much more about what you had talked about earlier, the opening up and say, okay, how much can I hold? Because the Sabri that was a really great person to hang out with on a Friday night is not the same Sabri that is tuned towards being a good dad at the age of 45.
Mm-hmm.
And the process of getting from 25 to 45 is a process of attunement.
Mm-hmm.
That necessarily means you might have to let go of certain things over that time. That's what I'm trying to point at with the transformation and the changing of a person.
Mm-hmm.
Is that helpful?
Yeah,
I'm
it
trying to be a
is.
good podcast guest.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's great. And I think, as you say that, it just makes me think, yeah, that it feels like that's maybe part of the thing that is also kind of missing is somewhat of a framework. As a framework for people for that transcendence, for that, in many ways, it feels like maturation.
That's exactly what it is, Sabri. It's exactly what it is.
Mm.
It's maturation. Sorry, I wanted to jump on that and make sure that that's heard, and I think it's well said. Sorry, I cut you off. Go on.
No, no, that's good. Please.
Okay, then now we'll start because we're both good.
Great. So this feels like a perfect time. You mentioned about theory and practice and TIAMAT. So I'd love to get into that a little bit more. The necessity of theory and practice, both of those things, and then also how that correlates and ties into TIAMAT and what you're doing there, and you're going to be in London soon. So it feels like a great time to jump into that.
I feel like we've dropped like a really important conversation that was getting to God to talk about my product, which I appreciate, by the way, and I'll try and draw that bridge, because the for me the integration of theory and practice has been absolutely integral
Mhm.
to what ultimately, and by the way, I didn't intend for this to happen, but became a spiritual renaissance for me. Okay, so I'll use something that folks might be more familiar with. Okay, yoga. Everybody loves yoga. Yoga's fucking awesome, but it's just not the poses. It's not just the poses. Anybody who has done the yoga teacher training will be familiar with this. But uh, yoga is an ecology of practices, so it includes the virtue cultivation, right? So your yamas and your niyamas. It includes the breath work. It includes the poses. That's a part of it. It also includes the meditation, you know. And you also have to read the Yoga Sutras, read the Bhagavad Gita, right? Like there's a whole ecosystem that's in there, and we've reduced it to a 1 hour class at Anytime Fitness. And I'm sorry, but it's I'm not trying to denigrate people wanting to be fit. I'm trying to point at the ways in which these different practices or these different domains of entry is actually really old. What we're talking about here, the integration of theory and practice, is not a new idea. We've been doing this for thousands of years across different civilizations.
Mhm.
Our ancestors understood this,
Mhm.
you know, and perhaps it's fair to say that in modern times we've misunderstood it and focused it down to only one aspect. So when I talk about, say, TIAMAT being an ecology of practices, right? What I'm trying to say is that there's the actual things that you do, right? The actual exercises that you do. We do our authentic relating, right? We do some yoga work. Yoga work. We do some asanas. We also do some animal flow stuff, right? We do some spiritual exercises from different traditions. We also look at philosophy. All of that doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's homed, and this is where the theory comes in. It's homed within the 4E cognitive science, right? So we try to understand deeply the mechanics of what's actually happening. And I ask John questions like this all the time. If I create this exercise, what is actually happening to a participant as they go through this? I'm trying to understand that. Because it can't just be, oh, what I think is happening is this, therefore it's correct. Coming back to the criticality point from earlier, what the theory does, and philosophy does this as well, is that it allows the practice to actually be in dialogue with other traditions, right? Older, newer, other practitioners, other facilitators, other teachers, so that it can be critically rationalized and refined and made better. Now, why we're doing this is because I think that there's a ceiling to the self help. There's a point where self help becomes too self involved. Right? So it's all about what you want, what you want to manifest, what you want to do, what your dreams are. Okay, there comes up that it's useful. That's good. That's really good because you want to be understanding of like, okay, how am I experiencing the world? there's a ceiling to that. At some point, the process of maturation is not about you. It can't be. Because if you have a kid, you don't want to be looking at your self-help stuff, right? And being too self-involved, because then, hey, you're not taking care of your kid. As a teacher, I see this all the time with my students. If I'm too obsessed about how I look to them, I'm not properly invested in their development. It might be the case that a student has to hate the kind of person that I am. They have to not like me. They have to think all sorts of shit about me. Okay, cool. Are they growing?
Yeah. Yeah, and if you become too self-referential, it completely blocks flow. Like, as a teacher, you can't be in that flow with students to really kind of feel into what actually serves them very best in this moment. If it's self-referential and it's like, what are they thinking of me in this moment?
Let's play with that, right? Let's say that you're perfect. Let's say that you've done all the self-help, you've helped enough, right? You've optimized to the maximum level and you're perfect. Okay. So what now? See how that quickly falls into meaninglessness again? And this, I think, calls into what you very generously offered at the start of this call, which is I can do something along the lines of like I can do all the self work and I can work on myself all the time, but it can't be that I figured all of me out already, right? There's more, right? There has to be, because if there isn't, then what the fuck did I do all of that for? Right? It's meaningless, and so now you're back to square one again.
Yeah, it feels like it's climbing a ladder and getting to the top to find out it's against the wrong wall. And
I love that. Yeah, yeah.
and it's so hard for, I mean, if we were to call it the ego or the separate self, it's so hard for that aspect of someone to get that there's actually so much more in contribution, or when I turn things from being egocentric about how does this affect me to how can I contribute out there. It can be so difficult to like, hang on a minute, are you sure that's more rewarding than a Lambo? Like, I'm not sure you're right about that.
Oh, God forbid my ego ever tells me that Lambos are far too expensive. Um, I'm struck by something though. Like I've noticed this across the conversation that there seems to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there seems to be like a heavier weight with the way in which you're asking questions. I get the sense that these things really matter to you, and this is my inclination. You don't have to go there if you don't want to, but I like to go all the way to the bottom and climb up and out. So I'm kind of curious, like, what is with the rest of our time? Maybe this is a direction that might it might take us in a direction that is quite productive. But what is your intimation of the most difficult question that you are holding right now about this whole space, like independent of John Vervaeke and independent of kind of wisdom or meanings? Like for you, what's at the bottom of that?
Yeah, let me feel into that. For me, I'm just aware that there truly is a possibility to experience heaven on earth. And there is so much suffering, and there is so many things that are held as or presented as paths that just take us in the opposite direction. It just creates more suffering, as whether it is the manifest this thing. It's like it's just another promise that tells you the thing you seek is outside there somewhere, rather than the kingdom of heaven being in your midst. Rather than knowing that actually the deepest feeling of peace, of joy, of love exists within us, that we can locate that. And that when we locate from that and we shine, we let that literally radiate out from us. When we know the depth of our being to be goodness, truth, and beauty, when I know that in myself, when I know myself to be sacred, and then I know you to be as sacred, I know life to be sacred, I know the source of life to be sacred. I just truly believe that if we can actually know that, not through thinking about it, but actually experiencing it deeply, that we can truly create a beautiful world. And I think there's a simplicity in it, and I truly believe it's there. And just in my own practice, I mean, just early this year through the Lenten period, I decided to fast, so I'd eat once every 24 hours for the 40 days, slightly more.
Mm.
And then I was 2 days out from finishing, and I just heard a whisper, heard a whisper from Jesus, which was, if somebody forces you to walk with them 1 mile, walk with them 2. And I was like, am I meant to do double the amount? So I said, okay. So I doubled it, and I'll go for 80 days. But just in that practice, I just felt so connected to what I would call God, to peace, to faith, to humility, to love, to seeing others as expressions of the divine, as sacred. And I just really desire for other people to know that to be a possibility that we can experience now. And we can do all the other things, but that place of being, of having a new existential stance and orientation towards reality, of understanding not just who I am, but what I am, not who you are, but what you are, that without knowing the who of Ethan, that I can know you to be as sacred as just an axiom. And then from there, I can get to know who you are as the character. I just really don't understand what else I really want to do with my life except be in contribution to that. That's really what it's about for me, is that.
Good. Now I'm dialed in.
Yeah.
And because I'm dialed in, I'm going to challenge that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not trying to challenge it to poke holes.
Sure.
I'm trying to exemplify what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
So let's take the axiom.
Mm-hmm.
And the axiom is, the divine is found just inside. Look inside yourself. It's a variation on the work on yourself piece. If one does that,
Mm-hmm.
right, and in a sense turns the eye completely inward,
Mm-hmm.
how is one to recognize the sacredness in the other?
For me, that would be in the moment I open my eyes. So in my morning practice, it's to go inwards, to locate that within, and then to open. And the moment I open my eyes, it's now part of the practice is, can I see it all around me? So for me, it's not just
Mm-hmm.
it's not just me I'm going to lock myself in my room and that's it. But it's like a priming of, like, for example, when I first wake in the morning, my mind is busy. It's been busy through the night. It's not necessarily restful.
Yeah.
So I find when I first wake, if anything, I have more of an anxious and depressive tilt.
Mm-hmm.
So I go and find that place where I almost have to come to a felt experience of myself in a completely different way to when I first wake up. And I'm devoted to that.
Mm-hmm.
But then in that moment, I feel like I remember and I return to something that's more real. It feels like that is an illusion. compared to where I get to after being in my own meditative, contemplative journaling practice.
Aha, okay. Okay. So there's a way in which you're going in, you find the perspective that's there,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then you, when you say open your eyes, to then go, okay, how do I bring that as a, almost as like a frame around how I interact and perceive the world? Is that a fair capitulation of what you've said?
Yeah, yeah. It kind of feels like somewhat like a psycho-ontological
Yeah.
shift.
If I'm ever misapprehending, please correct me. Okay. So this is something that I wrestle with, even for myself, especially because I, over the past few years, have taken on more responsibility in terms of the ways in which I interact with people, but also the amount of influence that I have on them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's in things like this, like a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
The words that I say matter. So I'm on the lookout for, like, okay, how do I know that the process of doing this, I find it inside myself, okay, everything here is hunky dory, I turn it out into the world, right? That I'm not just projecting, I'm not just putting on my version of what I like
Mm-hmm.
onto everything else.
Mm-hmm.
How is that mitigated?
That's a good question. How is it mitigated?
I can phrase it a different way.
Mm-hmm.
If I look inside myself to find God there, how come I'm not just putting God out into the world? It's just actually just me. It's actually just all my stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I suppose it goes to like maybe a deeper question of what do I even mean when I say I go in and locate that within, you know.
Yeah.
For me, it's when I enter into a certain felt state where I locate a deep resounding peace that is feels like whether we say beyond or beneath everything else. And in that, it's very difficult not to have a sense of joy or a smile come over my face. And in that, it feels very difficult not to feel a sense of deep love
Mm-hmm,
for
mm-hmm,
for reality, for life, and for others, and to want to just see beyond whatever the behaviors or however the life experiences may have manifested as this right now. But if I can locate that thing in me which feels like it sits beyond the thoughts and the busyness and the anxiousness that might arise, but when I can locate that in me, it's then and then to understand and that is in everyone else. And if I was to speak to someone, it's like, can I be aware of that I am, that I
mm-hmm.
am, that I am is that I am that you are type of thing. But it's something like that. That's more like trying to give words to, you know, because when I feel like I go inwards, it doesn't feel like it's propositional at all.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's completely felt and a deep shift in feeling, and sometimes to the point where there's tears running down my face. I feel like a different person altogether.
Yes.
And I feel like in that moment, it's like now I'm actually ready to enter into the world in a way in which I would like to show up.
Aha. Aha. And but here it is, right? Like that turn of now I can enter into the world
Mm-hmm.
presupposes that one was outside of it to begin with. And that's the thing that I'm trying to reconcile.
Mm-hmm.
Because what you've just described, that sense of depth of experience, of profound joy, and a real, like, ineffable contact
Mm-hmm.
with reality. I get that when I'm singing.
Mm-hmm.
It's really bizarre. And it's not characterized by joy in it's not characterized as joy necessarily in the sense of pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there is a sacred sadness, and it has to be. So I'll make the argument, right? if the divine is beyond all forms, then necessarily the divine is not just I'm happy all the time.
Sure.
In fact, that can actually be profoundly self-deceptive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? One can only pursue, oh, I just want to feel good all the time, and you get a sort of hedonistic pleasure. John's talked about this quite a lot.
Yeah.
I'm just refreshing it as a reference. That I think what you're naming, in fact, you had named this earlier, which is the opening of the eyes. The opening of the eyes is actually, I will reframe this as a kind of receptivity to what is outside.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an examination of that which is within. And I think you're right. Like there is a profound resonance that can be found within oneself, but we also don't want to fall into being too self-involved. That has to extend itself beyond the self.
Yeah.
And the I am, the I in the I am, collapses.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what you were pointing at earlier with a question about half an hour ago, which is the sort of the egoic identification question.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm trying to point to here is that I think when we're talking about a spiritual connection, it is neither within nor without. If it's completely without, then one is no longer an agent in the world.
Yeah.
If it's completely within, why would I interact with the world at all? I can just be divine within myself.
Mm-hmm.
And you have profound narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's between. And the sacred is that which binds both the internal and the external to the extent that they can't be distinguished.
But it feels actually more like again this.
Yeah, exactly.
It feels more like that. It actually feels more like there's the thing that feels so fucking delightful is it feels like the idea of me actually just seems to fall away, and the separation seems to just drop down, and that's where the tears come.
Yes, the I am is irrelevant. The I is it's irrelevant.
Yeah.
It's not a question anymore. And yet, it's almost like a Zen koan. You have to ask the who am I to find the I irrelevant,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and to just am, right? To be.
Yeah, I sense, I sense from the Sermon on the Mount, that's what Jesus is pointing to when he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." It feels like that poor in spirit, that emptying of my spirit, but what feels like the egoic me that I might wake up in. It feels like there's almost a point emptying of that, where there is like, and then there is the discovery of the kingdom of heaven.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm,
It,
mm-hmm. No, please, I'm just agreeing with you. Please finish that sentence. You're saying something really powerful.
Yeah, that's what it feels like to me. And I think when the Apostle Paul said, "I die daily," I think that's also what he was pointing to, is that that which is so convincing, the idea of me that is so convincing, that actually stands in the way, or that is the veil that creates a separation between me and everything out there. It's the tearing of that veil to reveal the Holy of Holies. I think that's what it feels like to me, if I was to give words to it. It's something like that. But it is it's not just to locate it in me, little me. It's almost like the recognition of the sacredness that flows through. It's the in, through, and as me, and all around me, and not located just in me, but not only out there, that it is completely both. And that's the moment of, like, it's almost like a feeling of, like, almost like that feeling of I'm home.
Mm-hmm.
I'm home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you remember my partner Ellie? She did a Q&A, right, of us on love. She's been reading Whitehead recently, and she came to me in the morning one day. We talk about philosophy in the morning because we're that kind of couple. And she said something to me which was really profound. She said, "I think I understand Whitehead." And I went, "What do you mean?" She said, the way I would describe it is all of us, each of us, is a molecule of water in a lake that's being rained on. It blew my mind. Like I felt so much love for her in that moment. And yet my phenomenological experience is one of complete and utter shock. There's a I, just I like I'm reliving that moment now, but it was almost like a deer in the headlights kind of moment of like, wow, so profoundly true. And because she's an environmental scientist, the connection of like the molecule. She didn't say drop, she said a molecule. It's like that scientific piece, and in the poeticism of this larger piece around the entire image. I think that really captured it for me. And I hear you saying something very similar. What Apostle Paul talks about is I die daily, which is a very Buddhist thing to say. You know, and the ego death, which your formulation is, I think, more accurate to what ego death actually points at, which is again the we can reframe Apostle Paul's sentence as the I dies daily, right? As opposed to, he's not referring to an egoic self in that sense, but the concept, the notion of the I. Who you are is not who you think you are. Those are very, very different things. But at the same time, I think to move oneself into that process where the I falls out of relevance, right, is properly backgrounded. Not to the extent of self-abandonment, just doing what anybody else wants you to do. That's not what I'm advocating here. Right? But to not look at the world only from the standpoint of one's own experience. That is a profound, profound journey. And that's also, coming back to sort of theory and practice. It's not something we can learn from a book. It's also not a 10-step kind of process. It's a continual revisiting, like what you're doing with just waking up, and you have a certain practice, right? And it's the revisitation of that actually ultimately builds a capacity and a constitution, almost like a second nature priming, trying to be that way. Which is ultimately, I think I say this with a bit of grief, but it's like when people come and take my workshops, there are a couple of ways that one can do that. One can do that as like, I'm collecting exercises, and then they just become instruments, which has its value to a certain degree. I'm not knocking that, but the true value is in the repetition. It's in understanding that the tool is ultimately there and in service of building a capacity. And it's that capacity that has a more long-lasting presence. One doesn't become a good parent by just doing the thing that says in the book every day. One has to be in the relationship with the child, in relationship with the spouse, in relationship with the school, in relationship with the institutions around, right, the larger political institutions, with an understanding of our culture and what that is lived in. And most people who have listened to me on podcasts will know that I aspire to parenthood in a powerful way. I'm very vocal about that. But I also know that I'm not one, and I won't be until a certain point.
Yeah, and that's certainly a beautiful mirror, parenthood. Yeah, Yeah, I have an 8-year-old daughter.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Bless you. Yeah.
yeah, very very sweet. We were out with my friends yesterday, and she was telling it was my friend's birthday, and she came and joined us at the meal. And she's very delightful. She's really sweet. You know, one of my friend's girlfriends said, "Oh, I really like your dress." She said, "Oh, thank you. I really like your dress as well." You know, she's just very
Amazing.
very sweet. And she was telling my friend next to me about hyperbolic discounting. And she used the term, and she's like, it'd be like, you could either have one cake today or 5 cakes tomorrow, and you choose one cake today. I was like, that's great.
Okay. When I'm in London, I want to introduce your daughter to Ellie. It sounds like they have a lovely conversation.
Oh, brother, I've got some wonderful little clips of us having conversations where, I'm kind of guiding her into this place, and I'm saying, can you become aware of your thoughts? And she's like, yeah. And I say, can you notice that you are not the thought, but you can notice a thought? And she's like, oh yeah. And then the same with the feelings. And then she's starting speaking about, and she's going into it more. And it's
Mm-hmm.
it's it's beautiful. It's such a beautiful thing. And and there's a real affordance for humility I've found is when I mess up, when I am short in that moment, and then I say, like, and I know, and I go, sweetheart, that wasn't you, that was me. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sorry, I overreacted, I this, I that, and and then and she'll say, oh, it's okay, Daddy. And she comes over and she gives me a hug, and it's just a continuous opportunity for humility because it would be so easy just to excuse my frustration. I know you did this thing, so I'm frustrated.
Uh-huh.
So it's definitely a beautiful. From my experience, has been a beautiful opportunity to continuously to see her as right now she's smaller than me, but at some point we're going to be two adults in a relationship, and knowing it's
Yeah.
going to become that. And maybe at
Mm-hmm.
some point it's going to be a relationship where she knows way more than I do, and I'm not able to look after myself, and she takes care of me. Like this thing is not what it was, and it's continuously evolving, which maybe brings us back to the regression and the aspiration and this
Exactly.
piece.
Exactly. And it's almost that turnaround, which is circular, where the aspiration is to regress into basically like you always say, like all the elderly regress to children.
Mm.
And for what it's worth, like yeah, I felt a little bit teary listening to you say that, and just in the interest of full disclosure, like I wish that I had a dad like you. Thank you very much for sharing that. Good stuff.
Oh, thank you, brother. That meant a lot. Yeah, thank you. I'm aware of time. We've gone longer than what I thought, although I feel like I could at least go the same amount again.
Likewise.
Um, where's the best place for people to find you, and for people that are interested in TIAMAT? When are you in London doing that?
It will be on the 25th to the 27th. We'll be at Shambhala Meditation Center, which is in Clapham. And it's really special because we've got quite a few folks which I'm interested to work with, and super excited to be with. I see them as mentors in a lot of ways, actually coming for the container. It's also going to be a group facilitated by Ellie, myself, Renz. We've got Adela coming in from Czechia as well. Ben is joining us from Singapore. So there's a whole team that's holding that container, not just how it used to be, which is just me and everybody else. And that's a massive relief because I always know that I have support and they'll check me and they'll, sort of give feedback. And also for the participants to be overall more supported. So that's a big thing. Yeah, so 25th to 27th.
Of July.
What we're doing? Yes, of July.
Yeah.
Yeah, of July. And then I think we're doing something. We're doing more small events, as well, which are what we call our crossroads and connections containers. Those are more for people who just want to dip their toes in, because the TIAMAT tier 1 from the 25th to 27th can be quite intense. So for folks who just want to dip their toes in, I think there's a discount available from just watching this podcast. We decided to offer it such that I understand you framed it as a contest, but for anybody who comments, you get 20% off if you come for a Crossroads and Connections event. And then the winner gets to come one for free, right? So that's kind of the idea. We want to offer that. So we're doing Netherlands for the next couple of weeks, and then we're doing London, and then we're going to Czechia after that. So, yeah.
Beautiful, brother. Yeah, I'll make sure we put the links for you, for the website, for where they can book, where they can find it, all of the details.
Yes, which is at 5tomidnight.org. Sorry, that was literally the first thing you asked, and I didn't answer that. Yeah. So that's where you get it.
Beautiful, brother. Thank you so much for this, and it was really nice that at the end it felt like you asked a question that invited a deeper dropping in, and it was great to go there.
I have no regrets. I feel blessed that you went there with me and you brought me there and guided me through it. Thank you, good sir.
Thank
It's
you,
been
brother.
a-
I look
been
forward to
absolute
doing this
pleasure.
again.
Likewise. Cheers, man.
Thanks, man.
Take care.